Sure. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 16th Connected Learning TV webinar in our weekly series. You can find out more about these webinars and Connected Learning at www.connectedlearning.tv. Today, we're very privileged and honored to have Jason Schultz and some other great guests discussing how we can promote youth interest in online learning while protecting our online privacy. Just a little bit of background about Jason. He is an assistant clinical professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley, and is also co-director of the Samuelson Law, Technology, and Public Policy Clinic at UC Berkeley School of Law. Jason has presented at many legal and academic conferences and is a regular contributor to news reports on intellectual property, privacy, and technology matters. For those of you who are watching on live stream, we welcome you to use the chat to connect and dialogue with your fellow viewers and to pose your questions to Jason and the others here in our Hangout. We'll collect those questions and address as many as we can, time permitted. We've also opened up a public Google Doc for today's session where we asked you to help us capture some of the more memorable moments and quotes and simply help us share relevant resources related to the topic that we'll be discussing today. You can find that link to the Google Doc in the live stream chat. Before we have Jason begin, I'd like to give our fellow Hangout guests just a chance to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about, real quickly, just who you are and kind of your interest and investment in our topic today, which deals with young people's learning opportunities and also the ways in which they manage, and we help them manage the kinds of risks that they encounter online. Anne, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm Ann Collier, and I'm co-director of connectsafely.org, and I blog at netfamilynews.org. I've been following young people's privacy and safety issues, as well as a whole lot of other interesting things about their use of digital media and technologies for almost 15 years now, and I've sat on a couple of national task forces with some amazing people at the Harvard Berkeley Center, the Internet Safety and Technical Task Force, and the Online Safety and Technology Working Group in Washington most recently.
I'm Renee Hobbs. I'm a professor of communication at the Harrington School of Communication and Media at the University of Rhode Island, where I'm bringing together a new kind of communication school with departments in journalism, public relations, film media, writing and rhetoric, and a program in library and information studies. My research specialty is digital and media literacy, and I wrote the plan of action for the Knight Commission on Informing Communities. I have a big interest in helping people develop the knowledge and skills they need to fully participate in today's digital culture.
I'm Jacqueline Vickery, and I'm finishing up my dissertation at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'll be starting as an assistant professor in the radio, TV, film department at the University of North Texas. I've been doing work on how teen girls use blogs in kind of anonymous ways to find privacy and expressions of identity, and then my most recent work, I have been working on one of the connected learning projects in a high school in Austin, looking at how teens use digital media in their formal and informal learning environments, and more specifically I've been looking at how discourses of risk regulate and shape teens' use of digital media.
Hi, I'm Kevin Bankston from the Center for Democracy and Technology in Washington, D.C. We're a nonprofit focused on keeping the internet open, innovative, and free, which in the context of child safety and privacy making sure that in protecting children's privacy and safety, we also respect the free speech rights of both minors and adults, up to and including participating in the challenge to the Communications Decency Act back in the 90s. Today, for what it's worth, is the 15th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision applying the First Amendment to the internet for the first time. And I'm here with my colleague, Emma.
Hi, I'm Emma Alonzo. I've Kevin said, I work at the Center for Democracy and Technology in DC. Our free expression team focuses a lot on child safety and privacy issues. We do a lot of work on COPPA, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, as well as state level laws and regulations aiming to protect children online. We tend to analyze these from a free speech perspective and see the way that well-intentioned regulations can actually end up having a negative impact, not just on adults' access to information, but also children's access as well.
Sorry about that. I think we're all learning how to manage the mute operations here. That's all of our Hangout members. And Jason, you want to take the floor and tell us a little bit about your work and maybe frame the dialogue for the rest of the webinar.
Great. Thanks, Craig. Just to check, can everyone hear me? Good? Yes. Okay. So I really appreciate you all coming and hanging out with me today. I find this issue interesting on a number of different levels. In the policy circles that I travel in, there's a lot of attention right now. There has been historically, but particularly now, to this issue of privacy, and increasingly to the issue around kids and children and privacy. And this has come about in just the last couple of years, especially with a focus from the Federal Trade Commission on looking at privacy policies and privacy practices and the design of certain systems online and architectures about what kind of information is collected about all of us, but also about children, and how it gets used and who can use it and under what circumstances. Add on top of that an initiative going on right now in the Commerce Department looking at best practices around privacy. There have been various bills introduced around Do Not Track, and there's one even called Do Not Track Kids, that are trying to look at the kind of behavioral targeting and collection practices across websites. And also the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which has been around since 1998 and implemented since 2000, is also undergoing a review by the Federal Trade Commission. So there's a lot of activity right now focused on this question of what are the right kinds of approaches to concerns about privacy. At the same time, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from the researchers in the Hangout to get some of the evidence about this out there, there's just tremendous evidence and opportunity for children to engage and take advantage of learning opportunities online. It's not just that information is being collected about them and used in a kind of passive way, but more and more my understanding is that there's a lot of active use, more and more a lot of active creativity and engagement and participation. And in working with the people in the connected learning community and the policymakers in Washington, there seems to be a tension there. A tension between more and more kids participating, and more participating meaning more data about kids being part of these systems, and that there are a lot of benefits that come from that participation, and a lot of rights that, as Kevin and Emma were mentioning, minors have even around free speech. And at the same time, very serious concerns about privacy and safety. And so what I'd love to do in this hour is talk a bit about how we should think about that, and talk about it explicitly, not as a debate about, should we have privacy or not. I think everyone's in agreement we have certain privacy concerns that have to be addressed, and not a debate about whether or not we should have children get access to these learning opportunities, because I think coming at least from the connected learning and digital media research communities, I think that's something that we do want. So assuming that we want access opportunities for children, and assuming that we are concerned about privacy and safety risks and we want to do something about them, I'd like to talk about three different things, and that's kind of the framing I'll put out there. We can deviate and roam as we like. One is, what does the research tell us? Part of the reason I'm excited, Craig, that you're moderating and that we have Jacqueline and Renee, is to look at what we actually know. And I know, Anne, you've also been reporting about various studies, but to talk a bit about what are those benefits, what are those learning opportunities. We could spend a whole hour on that, of course, but just to get some of that understanding. And then to talk, then move on to maybe talking a bit more also about the public conversation that's happening in the media, maybe in the policy realm. And so Kevin and Emma and Anne, we can get into that. Renee, I'm really interested in your conversations both on the research side but also in working with parents and stakeholders in schools and libraries. And we can talk a bit about where are those conversations as well. And then maybe even move into a bit of, okay, well then what are our options? What's on the table? What should we be thinking about? And what is the kind of right approach? And in there, I'm particularly interested in this question of literacies. And so Renee, I'd love to bring you in, especially on that, to talk about, well, what do kids and parents and everyone, what do we need to know? What do we need to learn ourselves? What competencies do we need to sort of help navigate this and help them navigate this? Now, the impetus, and this will be the last thing I'll say to kick us off, the impetus for this, for me, was a study that I did with Dana Boyd, John Palfrey, and Esther Hegatai about the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. One of the things that we all noticed among many websites, but Facebook in particular, was this cutoff around the age of 13. Facebook has a policy, although they're rethinking it now, where they don't allow any children on Facebook, in theory, if they're under 13. And this comes from the fact that the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act uses 13 as a cutoff. Children who are 13 and over, there are no special rules and regulations. For children under 13, any commercial website in the United States has to get verifiable parental consent and has to follow a number of other obligatory regimes in order to collect and use data about children. And so this has caused some websites and some online platforms to just say, the hell with it, we're just going to not have kids on there. And what we found in the study, and what other studies have found before us, is that, well, kids are just jumping the fence. They're lying about their age. They're faking their identities because these kinds of opportunities, both social but also educational and others, are drawing them to these sites in massive numbers, millions of children. And what our study in particular found is that parents and friends are helping them get online. They have knowledge that these kids are getting online under 13, and that they're even assisting them in many situations, and a kind of recognition that these kinds of opportunities and engagement, that there are benefits to be had. But the reason that it's concerning is that if the policies that we currently have are encouraging the sites to ban kids, and the kids are lying to get on with the help of their parents or family members, then we really have a dysfunctional regulatory system around how to deal with privacy risks. And one of the things I'd love to talk about, as I mentioned, is how do we kind of all get on the same page again? How do we all try and work together as opposed to at odds, and end up in situations which were unintended, I think, but have led to a way of dealing with privacy which I don't think is the most productive. So with that framing, I think we're ready to have a chat.
Okay. Thank you, Jason, for that great overview. And I really like the way your kind of three primary domains help kind of give us at least some bit of direction in terms of how we might talk about this issue. If you don't mind, maybe we can just let the Hangout, any initial responses, any other sort of additional framing questions you'd like to add to what Jason has provided us, just to get us started?
Well, I think one of the things that's worth saying, Jason, that's really a nice set of things for us to talk about, is that, I think children's media regulation has always spawned this be careful what you wish for phenomenon, where well-meaning regulation has unintended consequences that we can't predict in advance. And we saw that with the Children's Television Act of 1990, where, well-meaning effort to provide a space for more diversity in children's media had kind of the actual opposite effect. So it turns out that it's really hard to predict how what happens when the sausage gets made. And that's why I think it's important to be tuned into the full range of stakeholders who have skin in this game, because it's not just us educators, right? And it's not just parents and technology companies. So it's a really complex set of interests that are eager to re-regulate the children's media arena.
Other initial reactions or feedback, questions from the Hangout?
I'll jump in. I also really like the way you framed it, and I think one of the things that we're seeing in the high school that we're at is that, yeah, of course, a lot of these teens that are now over the age of 13 have had accounts on things like MySpace prior to that, and they've since kind of left those spaces, but those accounts are still there. And so while we talk a lot about privacy concerns on things such as Facebook, a lot of teens have kind of abandoned these other sites that are still very publicly accessible. And so they have these kind of digital footprints that they're not thinking about managing the privacy in those spaces because they're not using them anymore, but there's pictures and there's things up there that if you ask them, they probably wish weren't there, and they'll tell you they wish weren't there, but they're not going to go back and erase it because I think so much of the discourse is about protecting privacy on Facebook right now. But when they were 10 and signed up for MySpace and left it at 14, it's still there. So I just think it's kind of an interesting kind of unintended consequence also of how these spaces are still, there's still privacy concerns in these spaces even though the teens themselves aren't actively using them anymore.
Right. You know, Jason asked a really interesting question, and maybe at least a few minutes sort of engage in this question about what the research is telling us about young people's migration to the digital world, and in particular, in terms of the learning kinds of opportunities that young people are finding, as well as the kinds of learning ecologies that young people inhabit online. Anyone in the Hangout want to perhaps talk a bit about what research is offering us in terms of better understanding the kinds of learning opportunities that the online world is providing young people?
I think the research is really showing us a great deal about all the informal learning that's going on, pretty much starting with the Digital Youth Project that MacArthur funded to a great extent for several years. There was so much coming out about the kinds of social media engagement children are involved in, both interest-driven and friendship-driven, and what we're seeing about sort of the progression that's represented in the title of the book that resulted from, all that research by, I think, something like 24 researchers from a number of institutions. Really, about how children move from just hanging out, the friendship-driven piece of it, to messing around with the new media tools and trying out things in their areas of interest, whether it's music or writing or anime or any of these fields that they love, and then serious geeking out, serious professional work that's going on in new media by young people before they even graduate from high school. And what concerns me so much is kind of a lack of public interest in delving into that. We have visionary educators, some of them I follow on Twitter and learn a great deal from, who are developing curricula in World of Warcraft, in Minecraft, in some of these digital media environments that kids find very, very compelling. But the overall public discourse is so much about the negative impacts or potential impacts of digital media on children's lives, that not only are people in the general public often and the news media disregarding what the research is showing, but also even to some extent trying to discredit it. That was our experience coming out of the Berkeley Task Force in 2009. We had state attorneys general actually trying to discredit peer-reviewed research. So we have a real challenge, I think.
Yeah, no, thank you, Anne. That's great, and I completely agree. So I know over the past year or so that that Jacqueline and I and others have been a part of this Connected Learning Research Network, and we've spent literally this past year in a high school just seeing some pretty amazing and striking things about these issues in a kind of concrete and very visible way. Jacqueline, you want to share maybe a couple of ideas, reflections, kind of findings from that work that we've been doing?
Sure. Well, we've been in an after-school digital media space, and so a lot of the teens that we have been working with are already very passionate about media, or through this club have discovered a passion for media, and so they have been creating some pretty elaborate videos and movies, and one of the places that they get all their ideas is from things like YouTube and Flickr and Tumblr, and these spaces that provide them a lot of inspiration and creativity, but also they find open source images, open source songs that they can use and incorporate into their own media productions. And one of the kind of concerns that we've seen is that a lot of the students aren't actually distributing their work. So they're sort of participating in these different online spaces and communities such as YouTube, but they're not actually taking the next step to distribute their own work. And one of the reasons that a lot of the students have told us is that they're actually afraid of someone stealing their work. So they talk about issues of literacies, of not knowing how to protect their own work. And so they just don't take that next step to actually get feedback, critique on their own work, even though they are invested in these communities, but not fully invested in these communities.
Yeah. And if I could just add one thing, I mean, there are obviously many things that we've learned over the course of the year, but it's quite striking and fascinating to see how young people are kind of migrating to the online world to really expand their learning opportunities and learning ecology. So what we're finding, particularly in this school, that's in terms of resources, is struggling, quite frankly, in terms of enriched kind of learning opportunities. It's kind of difficult to deliver that in this school. How the online world has become kind of an alternative gateway for many students to find other people who connect to their interests, resources, just really kind of reimagining what the online world might provide in terms of the things that they want to know, the things that they want to do, how the online world has become a really valuable resource. So what we've seen in some very kind of real and visible ways are young people not necessarily just goofing off online in school. Now, that certainly happens at times, but also sort of using the online world as a way to kind of expand and enrich other kinds of learning possibilities that, quite frankly, this school struggles to deliver on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think that's a really great point, and I think the issues of privacy are inflected differently for teenagers than they are for younger children. We just finished gathering data in 2 elementary schools with children in 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, looking at some of their digital literacy competencies. And in a well-resourced suburban school with mothers who have master's degrees, we see a lot of children who are really active participants in a digital play and learning activities, and certainly involved very actively in using apps and creative play activities in the online space. In the urban community, we're not seeing as much production activity, and that is a paradigm that's reproduced in other kinds of communities as well. It turns out that you may need to have a peer network that supports thinking of yourself as an author in order to feel empowered to make the most out of a digital learning environment. And right now, for many kids, the dominant modality for using media is as a spectator. So lots and lots of consuming activities are normative in those practices, and some commenting or some participation, but clearly the differences in social economic class are important. And with younger kids, there are also some differences in the way we understand the concept of private and public. So those 2 things kind of intersect each other.
Yeah, I was thinking, Jason also asked us to think about just the contours of the public discourse around these issues, and I'm thinking particularly given the work that, for example, that Kevin, that you and Emma are doing, and others as well here in the Hangout. What's kind of your response or a kind of assessment of the nature of the public discussion both in terms of media and amongst regulators, about how we are addressing these issues of risk, privacy, and safety as it relates to young people. And in your mind, what would you say is missing from this conversation that might elevate and really inform and drive us towards more real and productive kinds of policy outcomes?
I'll start that ball rolling and then pass it to Emma. I think I'll start with your last question first. What's missing, I think, is what this Hangout is helping to provide, which is more discussion of the positive benefits of engagement online and digital learning and literacy for young people, and the ways that it helps them connect with their world, learn new things, and meet new people who can enrich their lives. On the other side of that coin, there are the concerns about young people that are raised by the online environment. And I think it's very important in the broader public conversation to sort of tease those out, because often they're sort of munched together in a way that I don't think helps the policy conversation. I think there are concerns about young people's access to harmful to minors material that's protected for us as adults to view, but is not for children to see, which was the origin of laws like the Communications Decency Act, the Child Online Protection Act. Bills that have usually foundered on the First Amendment have been found to not adequately protect the free speech rights of adults or minors in trying to block that kind of expression online. There's issues of consumer privacy for children, making sure that they are not being profiled in a way that's opaque to them or their parents, or in a way that might disadvantage them later. And I think that's really what COPPA was meant to protect when it was passed. Then there's the somewhat related question of online safety. Are children going to be interacting with people who might harm them? And in revealing information about themselves, put themselves in danger with these other people that they're interacting with online. And I think that if you look at the discourse, the public discourse, what has been most in the media's focus or in parents' focus or in regulators' focus is sort of cyclical. We were very focused, for example, on predators a few years ago. So the cyber predator threat was something that was talked about quite a bit. It wasn't fully borne out by the research. Certainly there are some awful things that have happened online, but the numbers show that the vast majority of actual physical and sexual abuse comes from people that children know, not strangers they met online. I think somewhat in response to some sober numbers like that, the emphasis has shifted now to the growing issue of cyberbullying and how children, rather than being threatened by strangers online, are threatened by their own peers, and trying to deal with that threat. Although, as with the cyber predator concern, we are seeing policymakers often overreaching or proposing things that just aren't in line with reality, and that would end up impacting everybody's rights online without necessarily protecting children. For example, there was a recent a recent bill in the New York Assembly that would have essentially made it illegal to post anonymous speech online, which certainly is in violation of our First Amendment if it were to pass, which it thankfully won't. I think right now, one of the things that's at the forefront of the dialogue is how to handle COPPA. The FTC is in the process of working on a rule that would update COPPA in a variety of ways, and that's something that CDT's worked on quite a bit, and in particular, Emma has worked on quite a bit.
Right, and so, I mean, to kind of follow up on Jason's point from earlier, seeing that since COPPA was passed in 1998, we've had a lot of sites and online services take the approach of just prohibiting minors under the age of 13 from using their sites and service so that they don't have to comply with COPPA. Looking at the question of what's missing from this debate, especially when we're talking about kids' privacy, is the fact that we don't have privacy protections for all users in the United States. And so, sites can take the approach of just deciding to prohibit a whole age category of users from their site because there's nothing else they have to comply with. So they have, a way to say, we're not going to take on COPPA's requirements of obtaining verified parental consent before collecting children's information, and then we don't necessarily have to protect the privacy of the rest of our users. A lot of things we see, like in the Do Not Track Kids Act that Jason also mentioned, is looking at, was introduced by Reps Barton and Markey, and one of the things they're suggesting is applying the fair information practice principles for how to protect user data and talking about applying those to minors. But one of our big questions at CDT has been, why not apply them to all users? What are the privacy protections that people are talking about and advocating for children that we wouldn't want for people who are 13 and 30 and 60? So there's ways that you can avoid the kind of age verification problems, the categorizing users by age group that comes up in a lot of these kids-focused bills. If you take a look at what's the larger problem, if any, with privacy, and what can we do to make a better situation for all users?
Yeah, if I could jump in on that. That's exactly one of the questions I wanted to ask at this group, because I think we have a good group of folks who are thinking about children versus adults, and are there really any differences? And where are those differences? And a whole range of questions around when do kids learn certain things and how do they mature. And I mean, I'm not an expert in that particular area, but I get the sense that it's hard to pick an age like 13 and make that the cutoff. And one of the concerns I have is in thinking about this from a regulatory point of view, should we be using demographic characteristics at all? Right? I mean, we've got long histories of realizing that things like gender and race and class are not easy things to define, and they don't always define the people who fall within those categories well. And I wonder about this. It's very easy, I think, politically to say we have to protect children, right? But can we actually, come up with good approaches regulatory-wise that pick age cutoffs and things like that? So I'd be curious what folks think about it, because my leaning, and I'll be honest, is that I agree that I think the privacy regimes need to be more universal, and that we might improve certain aspects of them for children. Like, for instance, you could propose that penalties for violating it could maybe be higher if it's for a child or something, but I don't know that defining the contours of the access or use to data are going to be beneficial, because then I do think it encourages sites which tend to design for scale, right? They want to design for millions of users to pick arbitrary cutoffs, and that's what I think is a big concern. So if folks had thoughts about whether that adult-child distinction even makes sense and where, I would love to hear about that.
So Jason, are you a parent?
Not yet. Actually,
Okay,
I will be though soon.
So baked into the amazing transformation that happens to you when you get to be a parent. It's hard to understand it before it happens to you, but what happens to you is you have this absolutely primal, and I mean primal, urge to protect this amazing being who you have been entrusted with. And that urgency and that deep sense of responsibility is so profound, which is partly why I'm so frustrated with why empowerment and protection keep getting positioned as in dialectic, when in fact they're part of the same process. My job as a parent is to protect and empower, and I can't, and why do people keep saying these are, one's good and one's bad, or they're the same process? So I think age is a really important variable, because I want 3- and 4-year-olds to be going online and exploring digital media. But I have a deep interest in making sure that the quality of those interactions are meaningful and robust. And there's a huge set of differences between a 4-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 12-year-old. That being said, I think probably the reason why you're leaping to that crazy idea, which is age is irrelevant, because nobody seems to want to tackle the opt-in, opt-out thing. Okay, so because we know there's no traction on that, and there never will be, and the industry will oppose it. And so it's like, yes, it's true. Let's just create a sensible privacy policy for everyone that says you choose every time you go anywhere. You set your own space for that, and industry's scared to death of that. And so we have to figure out all kinds of other workarounds, because nobody thinks there's any political traction in opt-in, opt-out, and yet that's the meaningful solution for this issue when it comes to privacy. Just a thought.
Well, and let me just say real quick that I don't think age is irrelevant at all. So I agree with you. I mean, I obviously think that 2-year-olds would be different than 12-year-olds and 20-year-olds, but I do think that in terms of regulatory enforcement, right? That's where those kind of lines being drawn around things like COPPA, I think, are of concern. So I definitely am interested in learning more about how we think we should approach age differences, and I think they will matter, just like all the other demographic categories do matter. But from a regulatory point of view, that's particularly where I'm like, I don't think we've quite got it right. And it may be that the opt-in, opt-out is the way to go. But I think that's what's interesting to me and hard right now about this conversation.
Yeah, it seems like in terms of the age dynamic that, I mean, we all know obviously that there are different developmental stages across the youth cycle. And so, what's striking to me, in addition to thinking about those developmental processes that young people go through, I mean, we all know, and Jason, you alluded to the study that you and some of your colleagues conducted, that children at younger and younger ages, and we've known this for some time now, are participating in these types of practices. If they're going online via mobile devices, via iPads, via computers, sometimes owned by their parents, increasingly they may own. And so it seems like the kind of regulatory apparatus that's out there seems to ignore the kind of everyday kind of familial and cultural realities that are introducing and exposing young people at earlier and earlier ages to these kinds of environments and the issues that emerge along with them.
If I could just sort of jump in, responding to what Renee said, I totally relate to what you were saying, Renee, and I think, we do look at children differently when we're parents. There's no question about that, but we also have a way of looking at children at a societal level that I think we need to be thinking about. Not only are we transitioning, having amazing experiences, sometimes very scary, in a highly significant media shift, that's probably as profound as, maybe the Gutenberg press. So we have that we're all reeling from. But, another shift that's more subtle that was touched on by the digital youth researchers is our way of looking at children. There is a new sociology of young people, a new sociology of children that I think we need to factor in. And, a lot depends on how we view children. Are they an undifferentiated mass who, yeah, they have stages of development, but are they just passive recipients or consumers? Are we going to see our children as just consumers of media the way we were? Or are we going to see them as some researchers cited in the Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out book as active creative social agents? The Good Play Project at Harvard School of Education looked at this in the context of digital ethics. And two of the things they found in their qualitative research is that kids have a very strong sense of inefficacy, in their use of digital media. Renee touched on that earlier, and I think you did too, Craig. They also have a sense that they are that their use of media is inconsequential. And I think that's largely because of the online safety discourse in this country for the past 15 years. We have been portraying them in the news media and all kinds of discussion fora as passive potential victims and consumers. And we've been doing studies about their screen time through the lens of mass media culture that we grew up in. And I think this is unfair both to digital media, the new media that we all are going to be using from now on, and it's very unfair to children. And I think we need to start seeing them more as creative, active agents. I think that that kind of empowerment or sense of agency will make them safer.
We've mentioned a few sort of stakeholders in this space, and we haven't. We've alluded to schools. There are also families, who are obviously very important stakeholders in this conversation. Anyone want to maybe say a bit about either of those stakeholders and what we know about how they're engaging this issue of youth risk, privacy, and learning, and what, if anything, have we learned from their investment in this topic?
Yeah, I just got back from the American Library Association, and I went to basically all the sessions I could that were focused around digital media and learning. You know, there are teen librarians who specialize in this. The IMLS and MacArthur have been sort of seeding a variety of library initiatives, and a whole lot of librarians are really enthusiastic about this. But of course, what was absolutely ubiquitous in this community was at every image that was displayed of a child, at every piece of child media that was shared, was a question at the back of the room, always, in every session, a question in the back of the room, which is, you know, did you get parental permission to display this? You know, did you do informed consent with the families? And how do you protect the privacy of children in ways that are respectful to parental wishes? Because I do think that, you know, we smart people often like to think that we know best about how to raise other people's children. And that set of upper middle class moralizing about how to raise children is kind of normative, right? And we've seen since Dr. Spock and then some. But the reality of it is families have diverse ideas about how they want their children to participate in the digital space. And I think sometimes, I'm unfortunately think that sometimes our tone comes across as disrespectful of parental choice, like as if parents who don't want their kids participating in a digital space are somehow misinformed or misguided. And I actually think we get more traction here, and librarians, I think, are tuned into this because they're at the ground level, at the patron level. If we respect that diversity and we acknowledge some parents are going to have some sets of attitudes and concerns and priorities, and other parents are going to have other concerns, but without framing these issues around respect, then I'm afraid that sometimes we're going to miss the people that we most need to reach.
Yeah, if I could add to that too, one of the things that the study we did showed was that far and away parents wanted the choices to be their own and not someone else's about how their kids were going to engage with a lot of online content, and especially around privacy and safety issues. I think that's no surprise. And one of the things is, to tie it back, is if we have regulations like COPPA, and there are unintended consequences, which are that the sites are basically sticking their heads in the sand to some degree, or at least pretending that there aren't these kids on there and they're not offering the protections they should. At least our sense of it from the few other interviews that were done and sort of associated data we have is that it's going to make those conversations harder. It's going to make creating that kind of trust between the actual platforms and the parents and children harder. And I would imagine that schools would kind of be caught in the middle to the extent that they want to allow access to the platforms as well.
Yeah, to speak to the question about schools, I mean, I think that at least the school that Craig and I have been in, you can see them so much struggling with it, because on the one hand, there are clubs and spaces and teachers that view technology, as Craig said, as kind of these alternative gateways and opportunities for the students, but at the same time, the sites are blocked and mobile phones are discouraged, if not completely banned in some classrooms. And so you see this real tension between wanting to incorporate media and technology into the classrooms, but also being really afraid to incorporate it or not knowing how. And so there's just, from one classroom to another, and from one student to another, you get a really different answer from what the teacher's policies are, what the school policies are. And it's really kind of a negotiate on a daily basis what is and isn't going to be acceptable at that moment. So I think that, I mean, the schools are really struggling to both incorporate it, but also not completely lose control of the technologies and the students' use of.
Yeah. Anyone else? So we have a question from the live stream that, if you don't mind, I'll share to Jason and the Hangout as well. Here's the question. I'm thinking of offering an open line course for students, an international course, for credit. What kinds of privacy concerns do you encourage me to consider?
Wow. So I think this is exactly the problem, which is that there are going to be a range of risks and concerns to think about, and that can be kind of overwhelming. part of it will depend on what technologies and platforms you're using. And if you are offering this course and you gain actual knowledge or you target children under 13 in the United States, that raises the COPPA issue. But I would say in general, and this is kind of a place I'd love to turn the conversation to, I think thinking about, I mean, this alludes to Renee's suggestion of opt-in, opt-out. I mean, thinking about the level of engagement around privacy as a literacy itself. In other words, to the extent that the course itself creates the opportunity to have that conversation, or at least bring these sort of questions into the course, if only as part of an orientation or something else, I think you actually go a long way for people deciding, you know, what kinds of privacy concerns they want to accept and which ones they're not comfortable with, etc. But I do think that fundamentally, you know, it depends on a lot of questions around what services you're using, what platforms, etc. I mean, the number of privacy policies one really honestly has to read to understand what's going on out there in the world is overwhelming, and nobody reads them all. In fact, there are studies that say that it would cost you, you know, 2,000 hours worth of your time every year to read every privacy policy of every site that you ever logged into. So no one's doing that. But I think the reality is we want to have some reasonable conversations about this, and so I would say actually it's a good thing to engage the students with. And I would turn to, you know, the other experts to about, you know, what are the right modes of engagement for talking about privacy without getting too far down the rabbit hole or getting too off track of your other learning objectives. Because I think the more you integrate it, the better off I think we'll all be in the conversation.
Yeah, Jason, one of the things that we do as an activity is actually translate the legal jargon that the agree statement when you sign up for something, and we turn it into plain English. And we talk about why it's not in plain English, why it's in legalese, and how, in fact, it being in legalese encourages you to ignore it. And then we talk about whether or not that's a real contract. If you've just clicked on it without really understanding it, is that a real contract? So I do think that there's some beginning ways to approach this issue of teaching about how the law encodes privacy and what it means to click yes to that user agreement, and why the status quo is the way it is. Those are really complicated things, and most teachers don't have a good handle on them. I'm really grateful for authors like Joe Turow, who try to explain some of the complexities of these issues in language that mere mortals can understand. I think scholars often talk to each other, and there's some great books about privacy, understanding privacy. There's a lot of great books for scholars to write to each other, but right now we don't have a good something that I can give to a high school kid, or a high school teacher for that matter, to help them understand how to teach about these issues. So that's a place that we really need to do some more work on.
And to the extent that the person asking the question is wondering what they themselves should do about the information they may be collecting from the people who are taking their course, I mean, that's another key element of this conversation, is for those who are in the position of collecting information to think about what information do they actually need to collect from the people who are using their service, and to bring that part of the issue into the conversation and have, you know, from that person's perspective, as someone running an online course, what do I need to know about my students, and help to use that as as an example of thinking through these kinds of issues about data minimization or data retention or all of the other things that people who collect information and control it end up doing with it and need to disclose to their users.
One other area that I think is interesting that relates again to the conversation or the educational piece is also, what are people's concerns? We talk about risks, and you know, again, as an academic, I can lay out what I think the categories of privacy risks are. There are personal risks when people can find out who you are and stalk you. There are commercial risks where your data can get exploited in some way you don't particularly want it to be for a business purpose. The government can get information about you with, you know, maybe without a warrant or some other due process. But I also think it's very interesting to think about, well, when you ask children or adults or whoever is trying to learn through your class that you're teaching or whatever other opportunities out there, how do we really get a good conversation going about what are their concerns? Or if they're a parent, what are the concerns they're thinking about for their children? Because I think that's also really something that, coming back to your question, Craig, I feel like there's still a lot of that missing from the policy debate and the media debate. we really don't yet have, I think, as much information about what are people really concerned about, and at what level of concern, and what would help them feel less concerned. I think those are subtle questions, but I think they're important questions, so that regulators really understand better how to keep maximizing the learning opportunities and the access, and not to get in the way of that, but still address those concerns and risks as best as possible.
And then there are the external risks that the internet or online service providers have a great deal of impact on, and then there are the sort of internal risks, or what's top of mind for so many parents these days is reputation, the reputation part of privacy risks. And that's kind of what users can do to themselves and each other, not so much what OSPs and ISPs do with their data. And that's that's the nature of social media. That's the nature of user-driven media, is how we help users protect their own and each other's public image online, reputation online, future prospects, etc. It's a huge question in the public arena, I think.
Yeah, I agree with Anne. I mean, I think talking to the students for the past year, definitely issues of social privacy are at the forefront of their minds, of privacy amongst peers, privacy from parents, privacy from teachers, and also some of them are thinking about future employers and colleges, looking at them, but they have absolutely no idea what colleges or employers are actually going to be looking for, which is kind of leads into that fear of some of our students not even wanting to share work online because they don't know what employers and colleges are looking for, so they'd rather just not put a lot out there, which I think limits opportunities for them to actually start building online portfolios and networking with people by putting their work out there, but they're afraid of it. So I think issues of reputation management and social privacy are definitely concerns that we've heard from a lot of our students.
Yeah, and I wonder, given the school that we've been in, which is predominantly Latino and then African American, many of the students, more than half, kind of classified as, words like at risk and disadvantaged. Really thinking about, what are the discourses around privacy in an environment like that. As we begin to think about issues of race and class and parental education, how do those things also begin to shape the familial practices around these issues, and how do we better understand the ways in which these dynamics play out across different populations and different communities is something that I think we've been forced to grapple with in the work that we've been doing.
Craig, you spoke earlier about
so we have
sorry, Craig,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to just maybe cap it off if you're going to change the subject. You spoke earlier about, or tossed out the question about literacies, what kinds of literacies or competencies are needed in a digital media environment. And I think there really are three. It's social literacy, media literacy, and digital or technical literacy. And there's a lot of talk about how much technical literacy children have, and that's questionable. Compared to adults, it's just a different kind of digital literacy. But I think these three literacies really kind of are melting into each other. They're like a three-legged stool. You can't have digital literacy without having social literacy and media literacy at the same time. They all have to be kind of developed together, simultaneously.
Yeah, I would agree with Anne, and I think one of the things that for sure makes this topic of privacy so interesting and so important, and Jason, it's
coming to the end. Are there any kind of just real quick final observations that anyone wants to make? Jason also asked us about what are the options, technological options, social options, governmental options. Anything out there, any tools out there that you are particularly hopeful for or about in terms of helping us to grapple with these issues in more effective and productive ways?
Actually, Renee, why don't you go finish, because it sounded like you were headed down that road a bit.
Yeah, I guess my sense of it is it isn't so much about tools as about this kind of finding ways to engage in conversation about, well, something that's happening right now that we're in the middle of, but sometimes it's hard to see things that are happening right around you. which is the concept of public and private are reshaping before our very eyes. You know, teenagers go online to share stuff because it feels more private, right, than their day-to-day, face-to-face things. So for them, the web can sometimes be a private place to share stuff that you can't talk about with your parents or with the kids in your school. And so I think the very nature of the way we use these terms, private and public, are undergoing some transformation, and it's okay to talk about how those terms mean different things to us. And I think it's hard for us to see that because it's so close to us right now, but more than any tools or technologies is conversations about what it's like to be in this flux period where the terms themselves are transforming in meaning.
Yeah, I'd say from my point of view, there are 2 takeaway points. This conversation, I think, has really, hit on a lot of the important aspects of this issue. But number one, I think that the consideration of access, as these opportunities come up, making sure that policymakers in particular, but in general, that we recognize the value of having access to opportunities, and that no regulation, whether intentional or not, really diminishes those opportunities for learning, I think is central. So that's one. The second is the evidence-based research that we started with. I really feel like, people talk about Washington's a bubble, but I think in that way, getting more and more actual experience and actual research in there from children's parents, teachers, school administrators, librarians, because I think if we don't formulate a policy around people's real practices and real experience, then we'll again end up with a policy where people are doing things that might even be antithetical to the desires of the policy.
No, that's a great point. Any other final points before we sign off quickly? Well, everyone is welcome to continue this conversation in the comment stream on Jason's webinar page, and also by using the Twitter hashtag #ConnectedLearning. I want to thank each of our Hangout members for joining us. Jason, thank you for your questions, your observations, your research. And just one quick note, our next session will be Tuesday, July 3rd at 9 a.m. Pacific time with Joe Kahn and Kathy Cohen on the topic of mapping youth participatory politics. We invite you to let your personal and peer networks know about this ongoing webinar series as we continue to build and grow this community. It's been a pleasure being with you and a pleasure subbing in for Mimi Ito and Howard Reingold. And looking forward to many more webinars and just for Connected Learning TV to continue growing and evolving. And check out the archive. You'll see a lot of other great talks and conversations that have been, I think, just as informative and insightful as this one. Thanks again, Jason, and thanks to everyone else who joined us today.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks.
Thank you.